Rise of the Ronin was released in March of 2024 as an exclusive to the PlayStation 5 console, with a PC release on Steam arriving in March of this year. Developed by Team Ninja, who also did the Neo games, it takes place in the 1800s, with you having the ability to create a custom character and an open world to explore. So, is Rise of the Ronin worth playing on the PlayStation 5? This review is going to answer that question. Long story short, Rise of the Ronin is worth playing if you get it on sale and don't go in with super high expectations. It's going to be compared with Ghost of Tsushima a lot because its gameplay, setting, and open world style, and to be honest, it never reaches the same level as Ghost of Tsushima. I found Rise of the Ronin to be the classic 7 out of 10 game that kind of hits the market, people play it and go, yeah, it's alright, then they move on to something else. Games like Rise of the Ronin will have many fans loving it, and some fans hating it, but to me, it sits right in the middle in the reviews. Why is that though? Why is it just a middle-of-the-road game when Team Ninja has shown they can make some stellar video games? Well, it all starts with the graphics and technicals. Graphically, Rise of the Ronin looks pretty good for a console game. The environments are pretty detailed and colorful, and the frame rate was steady when it was on performance mode, and the facial animations are pretty good. But there are some downsides. Characters always just stand in place and talk to you, or chat as you walk next to them. There is also a lot of copy and pasting of character models in the real world, and it can be very obvious. I had multiple instances of the exact same character walking next to another one, or groups of people all using the same animations. And that's where the technicals come in. Rise of the Ronin wasn't polished on release, and it's sad to say that it's still not perfect. There are a lot of bugs, with the AI in particular being very horrible. Stealth is a major component of the game, but AI opponents just don't hear or see you when they obviously should, or they can spot you through walls with perfect vision. If you kill someone next to their buddy, there's like a 50-50 chance that they're going to react. You can knock over stuff, break through walls, and they still won't hear you. Fighting your way through an area would normally mean you draw attention from other enemies, but Rise of the Ronin feels like there is this invisible wall that separates each group of enemies from the other. And then there are the repeat bosses. If you felt that Elden Ring was really bad for reusing enemies, Rise of the Ronin has you beat. You fight the same people over and over again, and not just nameless grunts or mob enemies, but named bosses. No one you ever fight actually dies because Rise of the Ronin is tied to history and you can't change that. So you may fight the same guy over and over again and he just runs away, only to turn up again later. Dovetailing off to technicals, the game's mechanics are also all over the place. We're going to talk about it more in the gameplay section, but Rise of the Ronin feels like it wants to do 100 things, but doesn't do any of them particularly well. It's an RPG with tons of loot, but most of the items you get are garbage. It has stats and upgrades for your character, but most of them are only small percentage boosts that you can ignore unless you're looking to min-max your character. Very few of them shake up the gameplay or encourage you to stick to certain ways of approaching the game. It's an open world game with nothing really to see or do in the open world aside from a few side quests, which are all the same go here and kill people, or go here and kill people and bring this thing back. The best way to describe Rise of the Ronin is that it's like Neo if it was based on an Assassin's Creed game, rather than a Dark Souls game. It's not a Souls-like, it's a Creed-like, or maybe like an Assassin-like. It has all the same problems as an Assassin's Creed game, like overstuffed with mechanics, loot, and systems.
3 centuries ago, Japan was unified under the Tokugawa shogunate. Closed its doors to the rest of the world. For a time, the island nation prospered. Yet this Despite its apparent tranquility, conflict brewed beneath the surface.
Okay, let's go into the story of Rise of the Ronin. Right off the bat, if you don't know much about Japanese history, you're going to be overwhelmed with the names and dates in the story. Rise of the Ronin does very little to explain what exactly is happening on screen. I found, going back to our Assassin's Creed analogy, that Rise of the Ronin was very similar to Assassin's Creed 3 in that it assumes that you know what the hell happened in history. Assassin's Creed 3, for example, required you to know a lot about American history, and the Rise of the Ronin does the same with Japanese history. The game is set at the end of the Tokugawa shogunate. Now, for anyone who doesn't know, Japan used to be broken up into a lot of different states and provinces, all ruled by different feudal lords and clans. The game doesn't tell you much about this, so prepare to read a Wikipedia. Eventually, Japan was united under a single ruler, the shogun, who was from the Tokugawa clan. Hence the Tokugawa shogunate. The shogun isn't an emperor, he's more like a general, but rules Japan and the emperor is a figurehead. What happened in history was Japan united under the shogun, and to keep Japan unified, they eventually sealed themselves off from the West. There are a lot of reasons why they did that, including Christianity and Western influence, and the fear that came that the people would rise up against the shogun. For Rise of the Ronin, none of that matters. What does matter is that eventually an American fleet came knocking on Japan's door and forced them to open their borders. It was at that point that Japan realized just how far behind they were technologically compared to the West. They were going around with swords and bows while the West were using handguns and cannons. This was the time of cowboys in the West, and Japan was still going around with samurai. That's where Rise of the Ronin takes place. It's a time when the shogunate is on the edge of falling. Japan needs to adapt to this new situation or be consumed by the Western powers, and there's a lot of differing opinions on how they go about doing that. You play as a blade twin of the Veiled Edge. They are anti-shogun forces that train in pairs of fighters from a young age to work together to fight. You get to create your character along with your blade twin, but the preset option has you choose between a male and female character that's set. The one you choose to play as is your character throughout the game, while your twin shows up every now and then. Alright, so the story of Rise of the Ronin is very confusing, especially if you don't know your history or you suck at remembering Japanese names. There is a codex included in the game, and you can reference it at any time, even in cutscenes. You just pause it and open up the codex. But even as someone who minored in history in university and has listened to a ton of podcasts about this time period, I was still having trouble keeping up. The biggest problem with Rise of the Ronin is the fact that it sticks closely to history. That could be a good thing if you're going along as an outside observer or a character from one side or the other, but Rise of the Ronin gives you the ability to work with both sides. You're going to be doing missions for both the Shogun and the anti-shogunate forces. So you may be killing one side, leaving a mountain of headless corpses, only to switch to the other side in the very next mission. It's because of this flip-flopping that makes the story very meaningless. Nothing your character does really matters because the history of Rise of the Ronin takes place in has already happened. You can't, for example, stay with the Shogun and exclusively kill the rebels. You're a Ronin, you have no side, you work for both, and it makes the impact of this story not that great. To counter that, a lot of the characters in Rise of the Ronin are great, and the game has you forging bonds with them as you progress. The more interactions you have with them, the more missions you go on, and the closer you get to them. Unfortunately, the choices you make and the group you side with just doesn't matter at all, aside from the fate of one character that I won't spoil here. There will come a point in the game that you're forced to one side regardless of what you did in the past, rendering everything you did pointless. Overall, the story is okay, but it's not your story. It's Japan's history, and you're just taking a part in it.
Japan. The great white whale that's eluded all others. But my vision is clear, and my harpoon ready. Huh? Assassins!
Rise of the Ronin is an open-world RPG. There are 3 maps, each separated from each other, that you travel to as you progress through the storyline. Each map has its number of side quests available, along with bond missions that improve your relationships with characters you meet. There are areas that have turned lawless, and you have to kill everyone in that area before order is restored and the regular people return, unlocking a town or a point of interest. It's all that typical open world stuff that you've probably seen a ton of times. The side quests and bond missions are almost always just go there, kill everyone, or infiltrate and kill everyone. There are also so numerous that they became a chore to do, especially in the later half of the game. You will probably be overleveled and over-equipped for the main storyline if you do a lot of the side content, but you will need that boost since combat can be difficult. There's a difficulty option, easy, medium, and hard, and I played on the medium setting. Oh, and you get a horse to ride around in, but that doesn't feel great to handle. It feels very floaty, it has pathfinding issues, and sometimes it can fall off cliffs without damage and then other times you die. That's the open world, so let's go into the RPG mechanics. If you've played any Team Ninja game before, you know what the equipment is going to be. Rise of the Ronin is a loot fest, with gear coming in different rarities, stats, and offering diverse bonuses. Honestly, the gear options can be overwhelming, and the effects are often very pointless. Just pick the weapon and armor that has the biggest number and you'll be fine. Every enemy is going to be a damage sponge regardless of your gear, and getting an extra 5% to your attack or something isn't really going to make that much of a difference. Conveniently, you can set an option to automatically sell everything with a certain rarity or below every time you touch one of these banners, which are Rise of Ronin's bonfire mechanic, making it easier to manage. Moving on to combat, it's a mixed bag. I loved Team Ninja's approach to combat in Neo. It was tight, it was purposeful, and clearly inspired by Dark Souls, but with enough innovation that it did its own thing. You had a lot of different ways of approaching combat, whether with a sword, ninjutsu, or long-range weapons. Rise of the Ronin feels like they took what they had with Neo and just slapped some Sekiro mechanics, like a grappling hook and the reliance on countering and parrying attacks. Plus there's a little Assassin's Creed stealth and abilities sprinkled in, and then just called it a day. It doesn't feel tight, it doesn't feel responsive. It feels very button mashy, and each combat encounter can only be approached in a few different ways. Whereas Neo gave you this ton of options for combat, Rise of the Ronin only presents a few. Similar to other Team Ninja titles, there's a variety of weapons to choose from, all with their own positives and negatives. You can also learn martial arts styles, which have bonuses or negatives against different enemies, all indicated by arrows over their health bar or in the bottom right corner of the screen. But combat is usually mashing the attack button until you run out of stamina, then countering the enemy attacks that stagger them. Once you wear down the enemy's stamina, you can do an attack that does increase damage. You can dodge and block, but it feels like this game is really pushing you to counter attacks. The problem is that the counter mechanic is very hit and miss. Sometimes enemies telegraph their attacks in time for you to counter, but they also do long combos that you need to counter perfectly or you're going to get hit. Often it's just easier to dodge the attack and hit them a few times than countering an attack, especially when the benefits aren't anything special. It does deal some stamina damage, making them easier to stagger, but you can often get that same amount just by dodging and striking them from behind, since your regular attacks also do stamina damage. Like I said before, combat is a mixed bag. There are a few highlights, like headshots from a rifle instantly killing most regular enemies, but by the end of the game, I found myself running through large levels, ignoring combat in order to reach the end boss quicker, since I knew the experience I would get wouldn't really give me that much of a bonus, and the end boss was going to be the same one that I had fought a few times before. Alright, let's go into the pros and cons of Rise of the Ronin. For the pros, the game has a lot of content, and just the main storyline alone will take you 20 or 25 hours to complete. If you want to do all the side content, you're looking at 60 or even more hours. The open world is large, with a lot of different things to do in it. There's a ton of side content and character interactions. If you're a fan of this time period and history, it's interesting to see, just don't expect a ton of lore accuracy. Events do get shifted around, characters look very different and act very different from history. For the cons, combat is fine but not great. The open world is filled with Assassin's Creed-like collectibles and points of interest. The side missions are always pretty much the same, with you just going somewhere and killing something. The graphics for the landscape can be bland at times, probably a way to keep the frame rate stable. There are major problems with the AI, and they are probably some of the dumbest enemies I've ever seen. There's also some technical problems. Although the frame rate stayed steady, there were bugs and glitches. The story follows historical events, and your decisions make no real difference. Also, it can be hard to keep track of who characters are and their motivations. And that's it for another review. I would recommend getting Rise of the Ronin on sale for like $20 or $30. Anything more than that would be pushing beyond the value you get from playing it. If you're looking to play it on PC, I wouldn't pre-order it. Wait until you see what kind of state the game is in on release, because the PlayStation 5 version was rough at launch and it's still not perfect. I'm the Casual Console Gamer, and I'll see you all in the next review where I play Star Wars Outlaws.